Well, it's wonderful to see you all here. I said, do people really come to an 8 o'clock breakfast? And I was assured that librarians, in addition to being excellent people, are also responsible people who get up early and come to early morning breakfasts. So it's great to see you all here. I'm going to talk now for about half an hour, 40 minutes, something like that, about this book that I have written. As you've heard, it was really a labor of love, and also a book that I thought about as a way to get people who might not read a lot of history, maybe a little more excited about history. And so my aim in writing this book was to reach a slightly wider audience, to come at history a little bit sideways through the form of road trips through our public history to mark this moment. So I'm going to talk a little bit about why I wrote this book and what the scope of it looks like. And then I am going to take you along these journeys with me and kind of move through the book and talk a little bit about the various places I saw and make some stops along the way at a few select sites, one of which will, of course, be the city of Chicago, since we are sitting here. Chicago plays a big role in the book. About 5 years ago, I started looking ahead to 2026 and thinking about this 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, thinking about where we are as a country, and anticipating even then that this might be a complicated moment for a lot of Americans, myself included. It seemed to me that even in 2022, 23, when I really started working on this, that we were in the midst of a sort of bad moment for our public historical discourse, in which things in history, as in so many things in American life, were rapidly separating into two, I think, not very interesting camps. One was that if you were a patriot and you love your country, then you could only say wonderful things about it, and that's what the 250th was going to be all about. The counterweight to that is often, the United States, it's the worst, and that the things that matter are only its deepest injustices, its greatest flaws, and its most important mistakes. And as a historian, I thought, that's not really how history works. History isn't a story that's just about heroes or villains. And particularly in American history, we have a much more dynamic and mobile and changing history with highs and lows and greatness and deep, deep failures, division and unity. And so I wanted a way to engage this moment that would break out of those two modes and capture a little bit more about what I think history is all about, and particularly the history of this country. I am also really a historian of the 20th century. That's my specialty at Yale. I teach a big lecture course called The American Century. It's all about the 20th century. I also teach a partner lecture course called The Un-American Century, which is also about the 20th century, but seen through some different lenses. That's really about debates over communism and anti-communism in the 20th century, all of which is to say, I knew that I was not, to mark the 250th, going to write a book about the American Revolution or the Declaration of Independence. There were a lot of people who were better qualified to do that than I. But I thought that the 250th really shouldn't just be about the Declaration, though I encourage everyone to participate in the Readex experiment, which is having librarian after librarian read segments of the Declaration of Independence out loud. So you may be tracked down to do that at some point over the course of the conference. But I knew that that was not going to be my strong suit. And I also thought, most of this country was not part of the United States in the 1770s and 1780s. And so I wanted to do a project that would capture the full sweep of American history, that would give me an excuse to go back into those periods that I spend a lot less time in, the 18th century, the 19th century, the period of the country's founding. And that would also kind of mark this moment as a moment not just to venerate the founders or even to contemplate the Declaration of Independence, but to think about the full sweep of American history. And what I came up with, as you've already heard, was a series of road trips through the country that make their way through not only the geography of the contiguous lower 48, but that also make their way through American history as a chronological experience. The book is 13 chapters. Each one of those chapters is both a place and a moment in time. And so I did these journeys myself. I will admit there was also something of a personal motivation for doing this because I had just finished writing that big giant biography of the FBI director, J. Edgar Hoover, that had taken me more than a decade. That was mostly me sitting alone in a room with a bunch of documents and one very, very strange man that I was thinking about. And I really wanted to think about some other things and get out of the office and talk with some actually more down-to-earth human beings. And so that was my personal motivation. I also have always loved doing this kind of travel to historic sites. I think the greatest virtue, this is probably true of librarians as well, I think the greatest virtue that a historian can have is curiosity. And so wherever I am curious about knowing the history of that place. For me, it really grounds me, helps me to understand what I'm seeing around me. And so this was a labor of love, but also one of pleasure. And I had spent a lot of time over my son's childhood dragging him around to such glamorous places as the tomb of William Henry Harrison and the Ted Kennedy Senate Center up in Massachusetts. And I just had this suspicion and this feeling that there were lots of parents out there who really wanted to drag their children around to historic sites to mark the 250th. And so this is a little bit of a guide to doing that. I think of it as a mom book. It is very much me in the mode of citizen and mother, as well as historian. And in that sense, it is a little bit of a riff on this great American tradition of the road trip. Most of the books about road trips that loom large in our imagination are books that are written by sort of swaggering male protagonists who set out on the road to do fabulous things or take lots of drugs or, assert their force in the world. I do a little bit of that, not so much the drugs, but a little bit of self-assertion. But it's a different way of doing a road trip, and I hope one that will engage a lot of people. So the point of this book, as you've heard, in addition to providing a fairly literal map of 250 years of American history, is to test out the claim that, in fact, we can know our history and still love this country. Trying to get at some of the tensions between those two impulses, to think a little bit about what active but critical patriotism looks like. And that's one of the reasons that I chose the title that this book has, This Land Is Your Land. That is, of course, the title of Woody Guthrie's famous song from the 1940s. What appealed to me about that is that that song was both an anthem of love and also an anthem of protest. And they are there together. I think in the way that we learn it, mostly in preschool or elementary school, we tend to forget the protest part that was sort of baked into that story in the midst of the Great Depression and the dawn of World War II. But both of those pieces are there. I want both of those pieces, wanted them to be here in this book. And it is also an exhortation, this title. This land is your land. This land is your land. Go out and see it. Figure out what you want to make of it, and take action. And so that is the spirit of this book as well. So those are some of the broad themes that I try to weave through the book. One last one that I'll mention is the theme of mobility itself. As I was traveling the country, one of the things that I didn't expect to see, but that happened again and again, is that I saw the same historical characters emerge in place after place. Places that we think are wildly different from each other, don't have much in common with each other. Nonetheless, they were looking to the same historical touchstones, often the Declaration, the Constitution, a story of the United States and what it could be. Those stories recurred again and again, but sometimes it was literally individual people. So this book is about my travels, but every chapter also opens with someone in history who traveled from one place to another, often conveniently the places that I was going from chapter 1 to chapter 2, for instance. But I think it really underscores the ways in which our imagination, which is now dominated by a kind of red-blue map, places very fixed in one color and fixed in space and time, also really doesn't capture the mobile, dynamic nature of this history as it was embodied in not only the country at large, but in individual people's experiences. And so the book is full of characters who, in their own moment in time, looked out at their country, said, there are things I love, there are things that I want, there are things that I detest, there are things that I want to change, and set out to do that. And so it's in conversation, not only with the 250th, but with those characters as well. All right, so where did I go? You're going to be seeing a number of maps up here. These are the maps that introduce each chapter of the book. You will notice that they are not maps in the sense that you are going to hit the road and use these as your guides. They are also not maps in the sense that the images there are unlabeled. Some of them you will recognize immediately. Others you will wonder what they are. And I'm not going to identify every image up there, but that was part of the idea that these are particularly for younger readers, but really for anyone. It's a way to play a little bit of mix and match as you go through the book. And as you read that chapter, you're able to look back at that map, identify what these places and images are, and they're just really intended also to spark a bit of curiosity. But for our purposes here today, they are a useful shorthand to give you a sense of where I went. I started off somewhat predictably in the city of Philadelphia in the era of the American Revolution and the signing of the Declaration. There were two reasons for that. One is that that's where the country began. The other is that that's where I began. I am from Philadelphia. I grew up in Delaware County, right outside of the city. And so that opening chapter is mostly about Philadelphia, but it's also about growing up as a young person and trying to make sense of where I fit into that history. The book opens with a searing childhood memory of mine that was about the bicentennial in 1976. I was 4 years old at the time, good little girl right outside of Philadelphia. And as you can imagine, the bicentennial was a big deal in Philadelphia. My parents decided to mark this by forcing me to march in a bicentennial parade dressed as a peanut. And 1976 was also a presidential election year. They were supporters of Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter was a peanut farmer, and so there I was as a peanut for the bicentennial. I remember the costume being very itchy and uncomfortable. I didn't like it at all, but it is also the first moment that I can remember being in something like history, realizing that there was this bigger world, this bigger timescape, and that I was apparently going to be a peanut in that story. But it is my first memory that I call a truly historical memory. I don't know if the 250th will provide as many of those kinds of memories as the bicentennial or as early moments of commemoration did. I think that while there's a lot going on in the next week or two, our engagement with the 250th as a country has been much more muted, much less ambitious than what has been seen at earlier moments in American history. And I'd be curious to talk with all of you about what you're doing for the 250th when we get to the Q&A, but that's my rough assessment. So beginning in Philadelphia, the book also opens with one of the most important road trippers of all time, and that is a man named George Washington. George Washington, when he became president, one of the first things that he wanted to do was to get out and see the country firsthand. He made a point of visiting every state in the Union. That was just 13 of them at the time. But I think he provides a good opening because he made a series of claims about what that experience of actually going out and seeing the country, meeting with fellow citizens, could do to change your perspective. You know, he famously called the United States a great experiment, and a part of his approach to that was going out and actually seeing the country firsthand. So an exhortation from the very beginning to hit the road, though, of course, his mode of travel in a stagecoach with an entourage and a white steed that he could mount to ride into American towns is a little bit different than how I did it and how most of us would. The other thing that I think is important about Washington and his road trip as the opening of this first chapter is that his impulse to go out on the road was partly the result of anxiety, and an anxiety about whether what already seemed like a big and sprawling nation would hold together, whether Americans had enough in common to, in fact, last as a republic, whether people's loyalties were really to their families or their hometowns or their states or their regions and not to the nation at large. And that anxiety there from the very beginning, I think is a powerful anxiety that many people still have today. And through the book and through my road trips, I tried to engage with some of those big questions that have been there from the beginning. Another big one that I'll mention before moving on is Ben Franklin's original question after the Constitutional Convention had been sitting there looking at the back of George Washington's chair, which had a sort of half-round sun there. And the question was, is that sun rising or setting on this republic that has been created? And he, of course, decided, like a good optimist, that the sun was, in fact, rising. But that, too, is a recurring theme in American history. Is the sun rising or setting? Are we a country making progress? Are we a nation in decline? And I think that those questions are very alive in this year of the 250th. So my time in Philadelphia was mostly spent at the classics, places that I visited many times as a young child. Independence Hall, the Liberty Bell. There's also a new museum of the American Revolution there that is well worth a visit. And Philadelphia, of course, has one of the most concentrated centers of historical investigation, particularly for that period, of any place in the country. And so it was a natural place to start. From Philadelphia, I went to Virginia to take up one of the biggest questions of the American founding, which is the relationship between liberty and slavery. You can think about that a little bit in Philadelphia, but it's very different to think about it in the state of Virginia, where, of course, 4 of the 5 first American presidents came from, all of the major slave owners. And the historic sites there that are devoted to that history, I think, are doing as interesting and complicated work on this set of questions as any place in the country. Mount Vernon, Monticello, Colonial Williamsburg, to some degree, Montpelier, James Madison's home, in part because you cannot tell the stories of those places without thinking about what they were, not just homes of some of the most revered men in American history, but also slave labor camps, commercial slave labor camps. And each of these sites really deals with that question, liberty and slavery side by side in a different way. From Virginia, I headed to Tennessee to think about the other great dilemma of the American founding, which is that this was a republic created on land that was already inhabited by other people, by indigenous and native peoples. And Tennessee was a particularly interesting place to do that because it's the home of Andrew Jackson and the Hermitage. Andrew Jackson's plantation is a major historic site in the state, but it's also a place where there's been lots and lots of work in recent years to think in particular about the question of Indian removal and Cherokee removal, the process by which in the 1820s and 1830s, the Cherokee and other communities were picked up and removed from the southeastern United States along what came to be known as the Trail of Tears. And so once again, as in Virginia, as in so many of the places that I visited, one of the things that traveling, road tripping, looking at this history through a sense of place reminds you is that all of these histories are smashed in together. And so questions that people often ask, do you want to tell history from the top down or history from the bottom up? Do you want to look at this set of people or that set of people? In some ways, they're questions that don't make a lot of sense. You can't study Indian removal without looking at Andrew Jackson, about the politics around him. And you, of course, cannot understand Andrew Jackson without looking at the world around him and looking at the experiences of the people who were subject to those policies. So this book does try to bring those histories together, to latch on to some famous figures and some famous stories and some famous places, but really to use them to bring in also a bit about the grassroots history of the United States and the ways that that too is being commemorated and talked about at our historic sites. From Tennessee, I went to Texas, following the route of Davy Crockett, more or less, who turned out to be one of those famous characters who I had never thought about before, but is a complicated and interesting historical character, as it turns out. David Crockett was a congressman from Tennessee, in addition to being this kind of mythic Western figure. And it turns out that Crockett was the only member of the Tennessee congressional delegation to vote against Indian removal. It is one of the things that ruins his political career in Tennessee, puts him at odds with his mentor, Andrew Jackson. And it's one of the reasons that he then picks up and famously moves to Texas, says to the people of Tennessee, if you don't want me here when he loses his election, you may go to hell and I will go to Texas. This is now a very popular slogan in Texas. There are many T-shirts that you can find in Texas saying exactly that. But the history behind it turns out to be much more interesting than you might think. And then, of course, things don't work out so well for Davy Crockett because he goes to Texas joins in the Texas Rebellion in 1836 and promptly gets killed at the Alamo. And so I want to take a moment now and just read a little bit from the book to give you a sense of the flavor of the book from my experiences heading to Texas and going to the Alamo for the first time. I was saying in the conversation before breakfast that one of the things that you find when you travel the country is that certain places are very, very invested in their history. They want everyone to know about that history. I come from the state of Connecticut. Connecticut does not care really about its history at all. It would probably be difficult to recognize the Connecticut state flag. Texas is a different story. During our initial visit to the Alamo, I was going with my son, Nick, who was then a college student, and he accompanied me on a few of these trips. During our initial visit to the Alamo, things seemed simple enough. Nick and I toured the old church with its uneven limestone walls and famous scalloped facade. We learned the basics of the Alamo story, how a team of Texian, Tejano, and Tennessee soldiers assembled to defend the fort, then how Santa Anna overpowered their defenses, slaughtered them all, and burned their bodies. Our guide, a former archaeologist, wanted everyone to understand that the Alamo was not just a little church, which you see here, but that it had once been a vast Spanish mission covering several acres. In recent years, much of that land has been occupied by tchotchke shops. After the tour, Nick bought a Bowie knife with his name on it, and I bought a felt Christmas ornament shaped like the Alamo, crafted perplexingly by women in Kyrgyzstan. I also wanted to buy a t-shirt, and in retrospect, that's where I started to think Texas didn't want me there. Thousands of shirts were for sale along Alamo Plaza. Most of them weren't quite for me, though. Some had the classist Texas history slogans, "You may all go to hell and I will go to Texas," or "Come and take it," which is a slogan of the rebels of Gonzales, who were taunting Santa Anna, who wanted to reclaim a cannon that was in their possession. Such quotes were often accompanied by images of assault rifles and assorted weaponry. I get it. Guns are a big deal in Texas, and to be fair, similar merchandise is sold at other historic sites too. But I've never understood why today's aggressive gun politics should get to own all of that history. How about an Alamo t-shirt celebrating Crockett's brave stand against Indian removal? I experienced another frustration at the Alamo as well. According to signs around the plaza, San Antonio was soon to open a museum featuring the famed Alamo collection of Phil Collins. Yes,
Phil Collins, yes.
That Phil Collins, the mega-selling British rock star. Apparently, he watched the Disney show about Davy Crockett as a little kid, got inspired, and ended up amassing one of the world's foremost Alamo collections. And that's now been donated to the city of San Antonio. I was there in January, though, and the museum was not set to open until March. And so I figured I'd have to come back. I made plans to return for opening day in early March, which is peak season for Alamo fans. Just before I was set to depart, though, I came down with COVID and had to cancel the trip. 6 months later, as I drove to the Newark airport to try again, my trusty Subaru broke down and had to be temporarily abandoned on an overpass in Yonkers. A Lyft driver got me to my flight with minutes to spare, but once I landed, my Texas troubles resumed. That night, I went out to dinner with a friend at a quintessentially Austin restaurant. Texas barbecue meets sushi-centered Japanese. We drank sake and ate monkfish liver, tuna tartare with guacamole, and Tex-Mex Japanese ribs. An hour later, I was heaving it all back up, and I canceled my plans to go to the Alamo once again. So that gives you a little bit of a sense of the book. It is about history. It is about travel. It is about this country and the places you can see. So there's Phil Collins having his Alamos collection shipped into San Antonio. I did, in fact, make it down to the Alamo for my second trip. This was a sign that I saw along the way, and I was wondering if that was about the border crisis or was about people from Connecticut coming down into Texas. But there we are. And I finally got to the Alamo at a moment when there was going to be a ring of fire eclipse happening there. So you've got these huge crowds out on Alamo Plaza, mostly to see the eclipse. I saw the new collection center, which has all sorts of artifacts like Sam Houston's snuff box. There is also a elaborate light and voice show narrated by Phil Collins about the Alamo. So it's very funny. You have this sort of famous British voice telling you this heroic or not so heroic story. And then I finally got to see the eclipse with my Alamo-shaped eclipse glasses and bought myself a T-shirt that I could live with, which is about the Ring of Fire eclipse in Texas. So that is the flavor of the book. It's a little bit of personal experience. It's a lot of history. And mostly it's about engagement with the ways that we tell our history around the country. From there, from the 1830s and 40s, the Texas Rebellion, I moved up to upstate New York to talk about the corridor of the Erie Canal and the ways in which the creation of the Erie Canal brought all sorts of new people and new movements and new ideas to bear. In particular, I look at the history of abolitionism and the early women's rights movements. And one of the things that's amazing about upstate New York is that some of the most famous people in American history were all living there during this period of the 1840s and 1850s. They were neighbors, they were friends, they were rivals. Frederick Douglass, Susan B. Anthony, Harriet Tubman, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, John Brown, they're all just there together. And I think they're good examples of people who are looking out at the country, saying that they have a certain kind of faith in the country, and also that the country is in need of deep and persistent change. For the Civil War, I went to South Carolina. I knew I was not going to visit every Civil War battlefield out there, but South Carolina is a really interesting place to engage this history because, of course, Fort Sumter is there, but South Carolina is now also home to a new series of sites marking the first attempts at Reconstruction. The South Carolina Sea Islands down near Hilton Head and other now very kind of wealthy, golf-oriented resort areas. Those were taken over very early in the Civil War by the Union Army and became some of the first experiments in Black emancipation, in Reconstruction. And now there are a series of really fascinating histories devoted to that and sites that you can visit. So the first place of secession, but also the first state of emancipation. For the post-Civil War era, I made my way out to Montana and the Dakotas to look at the history of the West, a history of settlement driven by railroads, to look at some of the conflicts between these incoming settlers and the native peoples who were there. Famous figures like Theodore Roosevelt loom rather large over that history. And then I came to Chicago, where we are right now. And Chicago is my chapter on the Gilded Age. The Gilded Age, this period in the late 19th and early 20th century, when American industry is becoming mass industry in new ways, when the railroad is transforming the American landscape, when the United States is urbanizing at an incredibly rapid pace. And Chicago really is the first city of all of that, the place where that is played out most dramatically. Chicago is also a really important place because it's one of the few cities in the country that has really preserved a lot of its labor history, the history of class conflict that was really central to the politics of the Gilded Age and Progressive era. So I came here to explore that as well. This was the beautiful day in October when I was in Chicago, and these photos here are a walk through the city to get to the Haymarket Memorial, which some of you may want to visit while you're here. Haymarket is probably an event that you've all heard of, a bomb thrown at a labor protest in 1886 into a group of policemen who were marching on the protest, killed 7 policemen, became one of the great trials of the late 19th century, and became really a catalyst for thinking about these questions of class conflict, of who was going to benefit from the Industrial Revolution as it was speeding up in the United States. It's also a particularly interesting story in our own moment when questions of relations between police and protesters are at the forefront of our politics once again. So this is my path down to the Haymarket Memorial, and there it is on Desplaines Street on the same site where the bombing happened. What's interesting about this memorial is that it has become a collective memorial where new groups can petition to put their own historical plaques on the memorial, many of them labor groups of varying sorts, but it tells the very basic story of Haymarket, and then you get other pieces. There are also glimmers of Haymarket all over the city. This was from the Chicago History Museum. It is a bomb that was found under the bed of one of the Haymarket defendants. It's a famously controversial trial in which it's not clear who threw the bomb. But what is clear is that the group of men who were put on trial were advocates of a violent revolution in the United States, and the man, Louis Ling, who made that bomb, in fact, then killed himself in prison by blowing off his own head. Someone brought him some nitroglycerin to blow off his own head because he would not allow the state to claim his life and claim his body. So this ferocious politics in this period, you can still see some of it all over Chicago. And one of the things that's interesting about a figure like Ling and the other Haymarket anarchists is that they often presented themselves as the true heirs to the American Revolution. Other places you might want to visit while you're here in Chicago, this is the Driehaus Museum, which is a sort of temple of the Gilded Age, one of the old Gilded Age mansions in Chicago, with an extraordinary array of period furnishings inside. This is me over at Hull House, which was Jane Addams' settlement house in Chicago. Hull House is still open as a museum where you can go explore some of the attempts by figures like Jane Addams to mediate some of this conflict that was so central in the late 19th and early 20th century. And the last place that I'll mention is Pullman. Pullman is a neighborhood of Chicago way down on the south side, was also 2 really important things in American history. One is an attempt at a kind of commercially viable utopian community where you would have the factory and you would also have executives and workers all living in the same neighborhood. This is the Pullman Palace Car Company, George Pullman as its visionary and leader. Pullman also in the 1890s became the site of one of the most famous violent and prolonged strikes in American history. So what's really interesting about going down to Pullman, 2 quick things. One is that the National Park Service has come in. They are rehabbing some of the old factory buildings to tell a story about American industry and labor, particularly during that period, including the history of the Pullman Porters Union, the first Black union in the United States. And then the neighborhood of Pullman is actually still a functioning neighborhood that looks much like what it did in the late 19th century when it was set up as this kind of industrial utopia. And so it's a fascinating neighborhood to walk around. I happened to be there when they were opening up their homes for the house tour that they do once a year in that neighborhood. So that was how I engaged Chicago. I saw lots of other places too, but really thought about this city as the best place to engage the history of the late 19th and early 20th century. And I will just finish out by taking you through the rest of my journeys. From there, I went to Atlanta to look at the rise of the New South, the creation of Jim Crow, as well as the rise of some famous brands like Coca-Cola, which come right out of the late 19th century history of the United States. I went to Dearborn, Michigan, to look at the 1920s and 1930s, another moment of engagement with the American industrial past. I took a trip down to the Southwest to look at World War II and the Cold War, which really transformed the landscape there. I went to famous places like Los Alamos, some more obscure places, and spent the night in a nuclear missile silo outside of Roswell, New Mexico, that you can now rent as an Airbnb. It was a very interesting experience. I spent some time in Alabama and Mississippi looking at the amazing array of civil rights history that is now there to be visited. Some of it, famous figures and famous events, others a little bit more hidden and just being developed. And then finally, as with all good road trips, I ended up in Southern California, looking at the late 20th century, in particular going to Disneyland, which I will say I think is probably the most influential historic site in American history. And then finishing up at some of the presidential libraries down there, the Nixon Library and the Reagan Library, and looking at the ways that they shaped the politics and the world that we're all living in today. That is me riding a horse with Ronald Reagan. So if you go to the Reagan Presidential Library, you can do many wonderful things. And I will just end there by saying that is also a meaningful image for me, because I'm about to embark on another big, long journey, but of the archival sort, which is writing a new biography of Ronald Reagan. So there was a little bit of a kind of personal story in ending there in Southern California, where I'm going to be spending a lot of time. I will just finish up by saying that I learned a lot on these journeys. I said one of the reasons that I wanted to do this was that it gave me a chance to be curious. It gave me a chance to be the student rather than the professor for a change. I came away from these travels actually much more heartened about the state of the country in two ways. One is that most people are living rather more complicated and interesting lives than are captured either in our online discourse or in our red-blue maps. There was a lot of curiosity out there. There was a lot of energy around these kinds of questions. And I also found myself somewhat perversely just reminded how bloody and violent and divided and complicated and fraught with anxiety all of American history has been. And in a funny way, that turned out to be a comfort as well, because it reminded me that at this 250th, where we are in this country is just in history, dealing with some of the same dilemmas and divisions and problems that people have dealt with in the past, albeit sometimes in a new guise and with a new set of challenges for our moment.